Subcultures, in particular the 20th century, have become an increasing part of society. Subcultures are defined as a group of people within a larger culture who differentiate themselves from the group and are also known to express transgressive behaviors. Transgressive behavior is defined as exceeding a limit or boundary, especially of social acceptability. Subcultures can be formed based on anything such as music genre, drugs, fashion, and religious beliefs. Subculture studies were first recognized at the Chicago School. They saw this concept as forms of deviance and delinquency. Howard Becker explains how subculture also results from the labeling process on the basis that society defines people in subcultures as outsiders. These groups are often perceived negatively due to their lack of conformity to mainstream culture. However, despite the negative thought, subculture groups are always here and have a strong appeal to young people with the image to be someone different and not conform to regular culture. Looking at different kinds of groups, from the mods of the 1960s to the skinheads and football hooligans of the 80s and 90s, they all share the concept of non-conformity and transgressive behaviour. Members of these groups are against the system and see the system as against them. After the Second World War, UK culture experienced an Americanisation. Things such as rock and roll, drugs and Hollywood style began to appeal to the youth and change British culture forever. The first major subculture to emerge in the UK was Teddy Boys, which consisted of young men who adopted the style of the Edwardian era. The Teddy Boy style was created on the streets by the working class in 1951 but went on to be used by wealthy middle-class men. Transgressive acts from this group mainly involve violence and provoking confrontation with other groups. This most notably happened in the 1958 Notting Hill race riots. After the Teddy Boys, the 60s and 70s brought about strong attitudes from the media vilifying certain groups and their transgressive acts. This can be seen in Stanley Cohen's 1972 Folk Devils and Moral Panics, which created a deviancy amplification around mods and rockers. He turned the term moral panic into a common use through his convincing accounts of events in an English seaside resort between mods and rockers, leading the public to have a strong view against these groups. As mentioned, the media had a strong influence on the public perception of youth groups. The most notable example was in 1964, which saw seaside riots and violence between mods and rockers in Brighton. More than 1,000 teenagers were involved and 51 arrested. There was fights between gangs and destruction of property. Due to the high media presence, the riots were reported to the whole country, which sparked moral panic about the British youth groups. This saw mods and rockers be labelled as folk devils. However, it's argued now that the reports on that day were largely blown out of proportion. Since the violence of Brighton, there has been a moral panic surrounding youth groups. However, this did not stop more groups from forming. Punk groups arrived on the scene in the 1970s. These groups centered around music, fashion, and ideology. They were seen as the biggest and most transgressive group of the 70s. These groups had a strong working class following and were very anti-establishment, and were all for the promotion of individual freedom. Now we look at the spaces in which transgressions and subcultures occur. One of the key features of subcultures is territory. This associates with subcultures because territory is a space which is taken over and controlled by groups. It's assigned to other groups that this is their space. For example, gangs in America hang around on street corners. This shows other groups that this is their territory. Once groups take these spaces, it then allows for transgressive behaviours to take place, such as drug dealing and violence.
End's massive.
Well, if it ain't the West End's massive outside their precious centre. Wiggity wackity shop! Boo! East side is the best.
West side is the best.
East side is the best.
West side is the best.
West side is the best.
East side is the best. Shit, I mean, west side is the best. Anyways, you is on our turf. Once you pass the Bumblebee's Day Nursery, just before you get to the mini roundabout, you know, on Elmsford Gardens, then you is in the west side.
We don't care.
Oh, yeah.
Places with overlapping meaning like Stokes Croft for its art and music, and Stonehenge for its historical presence and free festival are termed as heterotopia places. This term was coined by Michel Foucault and uses this to describe space that operates in non-hegemonic conditions. These spaces are referred to as spaces of otherness by Foucault, wherein different groups of people, often polar opposites, come together to create meaning for that particular space, as we see in Stokes Croft. As we have seen, subcultures and their transgressive behaviour usually leads them to being labelled by the mainstream culture. Jokyon found in his studies that labelling of subculture groups only led to more transgressive behaviours to take place. He also found how the labelling of hippies as dirt became a regular term to describe the hippie culture. Most transgressive groups were labelled with dirty words as a form of abuse and a sign of public disgust. A common example of this is the underclass. The underclass is a group below the working class and represent the minority of the population who live in poverty and poor living conditions. They are labelled as chavs and benefit scroungers by a lot of people. It is argued also that the term underclass was made as a code word by intellectuals to demonise those living in poverty.
The biggest change that's taken place is that there isn't really a working class anymore. With the end of industrial society, the old blue-collar working class really disappeared. It bifurcated. It divided into two. A big chunk of it, the majority of it, as they bought their council homes and so moved into white-collar jobs, away from the shipyards and the coal mines, they moved into the middle class. They became kind of lower middle class. But a large minority of it fell back in and ceased even to be working class. They became an underclass. They became people on welfare dependency, people of intergenerational lack of jobs. Your parents didn't work, you didn't work, probably your kids won't work either. And that has become much more insidious. The way of dealing with the old working class was to give them more opportunities, more money to get on. How you deal with the underclass, we have no idea. So what we do is we herd them into reservations called sink council estates and just leave them there.
Along with looking at the underclass subculture, we come across the Chavs, which has become popularised in the 21st century. The term Chavs is used a lot by the media to refer to the youth subculture in the UK. Chavs are referred to as people that engage in antisocial behaviour associated to lower class and wear imitated designer clothes.
In the noughties, putting two fingers up to traditional values seemed to do you no harm at all. Something was in the air, and we needed a way to describe it without sounding like snobs. We didn't have to wait long. Soon, a new word was on everyone's lips.
Chav. Chavs are basically gangster wannabe. What is it? Chav stands for council houses and vandalism.
It degrades people.
It strips people. His girlfriend, she's one of the biggest chavs around, yeah?
It's a bit, put it a bit...
What we tend to do, we do
about
love
the
people
streets,
together.
wearing tracksuits and just like enjoying themselves. I like my tracksuit bottoms.
Chav. Well, that's probably one of the defining words of the decade, isn't it?
The word chav had been circulating in Kent for several years. Then, plucked from obscurity, it stormed the web. The Chav Scum website, launched in December 2003, turned chav baiting into a national pastime.
And it's weird because before the word chav kind of came about, you probably would look at these
kids on the street and not really think so much about them, but once you've now got this derogatory label, suddenly there seems to be so many of them.
When we first heard the word, a chav was a white working-class man. He spent his money on heavily logoed sportswear, gold chains and sovereign rings. His girlfriend, a chavette, had hoop earrings and a bit of an attitude.
The underclass and chavs are current so-called subcultures that are classic examples of groups of people who have become labelled by the rest of society and seen to be demonised by the mainstream culture. We now finish by looking at how being labelled can lead to extreme transgressive acts to take place. Mary Douglas in her studies talks about how cleanliness and purity of the body can help to understand cultures. For example, the Nazi Party constructed labels on purity and cleanliness by portraying a strong, clean Aryan race, while labelling the Jews as a dark, polluted one. According to Douglas, dirt and its control is a central symbol in any culture, especially where ideas of dirt are highly constructed. This means that groups associated with dirt are dealt with in the most repressive ways, such as elimination through physical control. There are two brief case studies which demonstrate the transgressive nature of dirt and how such impurities can lead to transgressive behaviours. Firstly, Judith Oakley found how traveller gypsies were often labelled as dirty and out of place by the mainstream culture. However, Oakley argues that we judge gypsies based on our rules around cleanliness, instead of understanding their ways. She goes on to say that gypsies' outwardly transgressive practices were a symbol of their social and cultural marginalisation from everyone else. The second study of how the labelling of being impure and dirty can lead to transgressive behaviours is the genocidal cultures. Genocide is the most extreme form of transgressive behaviour, as this sees the mass killing of a culture group that is seen as a burden to the rest of society. The Nazis used propaganda to portray Jews and gypsies as being impure and dirty in order to turn everyone against them. This resulted in millions of people relocated to the dirty parts of cities known as ghettos. For example, the Warsaw Ghetto, which housed 400,000 people associated to groups the Nazis didn't see as pure. The Nazis saw that they dehumanized these people before exterminating them. The last four slides showed us different forms of transgressive behaviours, from the labelling of groups to the mass killing. We saw how from Oakley's studies that different cultures have different definitions and rules surrounding cleanliness, and how subcultural rules are different from mainstream cultures and can be viewed as transgressive. We then saw how transgressive behaviour can be taken to devastating lengths with extermination. This shows us how being part of a minority group anywhere in the world that's considered dirty and impure can lead to transgressive acts to take place. In conclusion, we looked at the history of how subculture groups came about and how they were heavily influenced by America. The two classic examples we looked at were teddy boys and punks. We briefly saw how spaces that groups occupy can allow for transgressive acts to take place. The two main examples we looked at were the underclass and chavs, and we saw how groups like these become marginalised and labelled by the rest of society. Lastly, we saw the dark side to labelling and discriminating of groups, and how this can lead to dehumanisation and the mass killing of groups. Thank you for listening.